you're too old to work, too old to work. When you're too old to work, you're too young to die. Who will take care of you while you get by when you're too old to work and you're too young to die? You don't ask for favors when your life is through. You've got a right to what's coming to you. Your boss gets a pension when he is too old. You helped him retire, you're out in the cold. And you're too old to work, too old to work. When you're too old to work and you're too young to die. Take care of you while you get by when you're too old to work and you're too young to die. They put horses to pasture, they feed them on hay. Even machines get retired someday.
And this is The World of Work, and I'm your host, Shep Cohen. Our guest today is Sandy Hanna. She's the author of The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon. Sandy Hanna is the daughter of an American military officer who was deployed to Saigon in 1960. This is before the major intervention by the United States in Vietnam. His entire family traveled with him to Vietnam, and before moving there, Sandy Hanna had never heard of Saigon. She and her family found themselves in an exotic land, living a life of French decadence, and this was prior to the horrific experiences that would unfold for both America and Vietnam. Saigon at that time was what appeared to be a magical place in those early days. Today, Sandy Hanna will highlight her experiences in Saigon and what was happening during the years that she was there. Sandy Hanna, thank you for joining us on The World of Work. I'm looking forward to speaking with you this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this today, too.
And what led you to write a memoir?
Well, I would go back to visit my parents occasionally. They had retired and taken up living in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And whenever I'd go, he would go down in the basement and come up with things. For example, he went down one time and came up with a negative that had Patton on it. And he said, they asked old Georgie what he was going to do when he got to the Rhine, and he said, I'm going to piss in it. And so I have this negative. He would come up with all sorts of things. So one day he came up with this kind of aging folder that had the word Leave Aunt Sam on it. And he pulled out these beautifully written onion skin paper that had just little tiny words written across every part of it. And he slid it across the table and he said, it's time. And I said, well, what's the time for, Colonel? I still called him Colonel.
Yes.
And he said, well, it's time that you did something with this. My counterpart, do you remember him, Colonel Lee Van Sam? I said, yes, I remember him perfectly. I used to spy on them when they would meet at night down in our living room. He said, well, he wrote an expose on the Diem regime as a result of his wife seeing Madame Nu going into a Vietnamese general's boudoir at Balat. And Mrs. Sam ran home with her kids, told her husband. He spent 2 nights writing this and coming in the middle of the night and giving it to my father. He said, I'm giving you this at risk of my life, and you must hold on to it and use it if something happens to me. So what happened was, when he gave me this document, he said, if you don't understand history, you are destined to repeat it. And people don't understand what happened in Vietnam. And I'm giving you this to do something with because it's time. So I asked, do you want an accurate documentary? And he said, no, I want a compelling story because people don't like to talk about Vietnam. So you're going to have to bring them in a way in which they engage in the story and then educate them. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. And I think I've succeeded in it from the responses that I've had.
You have very well. Why is it that you discovered veterans don't like to speak about their experiences in Vietnam, especially with their families?
I think they feel that there's no way to relate to what they're going to speak about. And I understand that. I mean, I find very few people can relate to my life if I start telling the story in a certain way. I have talked to veterans, and in fact, I was having dinner at this restaurant, and there was a woman sitting next to me, and we started talking. It turned out she was visiting her father, who was a veteran, and we started talking about Vietnam, that he'd been a Vietnam vet. And she said, he won't talk to me about any of this. She said, wait a minute, let me call him. So she got him on the phone, and I got on and I said, sir, how many Bami Bas did you drink while you were in Saigon? And he started laughing. And he and I had a great conversation because I came in with something he could relate to, and we began to talk. But I think for most veterans, it was a horrific time. Those that ended up in when the conflict became so horrible, I think they have a very hard time relating to people who've never been involved in countries where this type of thing is going on, or even have an understanding of a culture and a history that's so different from ours. So I'm finding that a lot of the uh, spouses of veterans are enjoying the story because it gives them access, and it also gives them a chance to understand what went into our becoming involved, number one, and two, uh, why it all went wrong.
Now, what was the life generally of a child of a military person who traveled around the world like?
We
What,
were a pretty independent group. We could land on our feet. We could learn the language. We could adapt. We could make friends. We'd have short windows to do this in because normally our tour of duties anywhere was about 2 years. So you made friends quickly. You found out what you liked about people. You didn't worry about what you didn't like, and you went from there. So we really were very, very creative, I think. And Vietnam, for example, we were supposed to be supervised by this group of servants that had been assigned to the villa we'd been given, which was pretty exotic as far as we were concerned. They pretty much ignored us, and we ignored them. And we just took off and did things. Our parents weren't around, they were busy. So my older brother and I, at one point, set up a business on the black market. We were selling baby powder and Hershey bars that we'd pick up at the post exchange before we got on the underground bus that went to the underground theater. And we pretty much had a life of our own. We went to the Circle Sportif, which was a French swim club. We learned French. We would hail down cyclos and taxis and go wherever we want. There was there seemed to be an unwritten rule that the foreign kids were not to be bothered, and so we were fairly confident in our freedom.
where'd you go to school?
In Vietnam, well, in most posts we were at, it was always a government-run school, but in Vietnam it was called the American Community School. And there are many and many of these around the world wherever there are going to be military postings. This wasn't, since Vietnam did not have a base. We lived in town, and the school was just on the outskirts near the Tan Son Nhut Airport. And it had been an old French villa school, and later it became a military hospital during the conflict in 1975 era. And then later, I think the Vietnamese made it a military museum.
I said in my opening that before you got to Saigon, you had never heard of Saigon. Am I correct?
No, I had not. We in fact, the way my father had of informing us we were leaving would be he would get out the globe. He had this old globe from his days at Texas A&M. Yeah, we'd come home, and when we'd see that globe on the table, we knew that things were changing. And generally, they only gave us about a week or 2 weeks of notice. And they would say, okay, you can take one thing, pick it out. Do you want it to be the one thing you took before, or would you like something new to take? But he would set this the globe up, and then he would spin it. And as it was slowing down, his finger would land on whatever state or whatever country we were now going to. In this case, it was an old globe, so it said Indochina. And
Ah,
Indochina had been the grouping of Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam. But after World War II, when it was the Geneva Accord was signed, the it was divided into three countries, and Vietnam was the only one they divided. So we were going to Vietnam, and what he would do is then backtrack Vietnam to where we were at that time, which was Illinois, and we would see the track that we were going to be taking to get there, which led going down to Texas to see our grandparents and up to San Francisco to Travis Air Force Base, and to be flying out on a four-engine Navy plane that would stop in Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hawaii, finally reaching Saigon.
and how many people were on the plane with you? So it was a small group.
We were the only family. The rest of it was military officers in general, or some diplomats. Um, but at that point in time, on that particular flight, it was just us, four kids and my parents, which made my mother terribly nervous because it was a 3-day flight. So, and we were young children. So, um, it was not a comfortable flight. It had the food was basically in ration boxes. They were the kind that you got if you were in the military. So everything was in a brown can or brown box with no identifying word on it, and that's what we got to eat while we flew.
This was 1960.
1960.
I've heard that the heat and humidity are overwhelming in Vietnam. Did you feel that? Was that
Oh, when that plane landed in Pontoon Airport and that door opened, it was like walking into a Dutch oven. It just took your breath out of you. It was sweltering. Um, However, I think you eventually get used to it because I don't remember. That's one moment I remembered it being completely unbearable. But then from that point on, I think I adapted to it. And of course, we would go to school for half a day, and then we would end up in this French swim club, the Cirque Sportif, for the rest of the day, cooling off until we'd go home. And we had the overhead fans and that kind of thing. And the French villas had marble floors, so they tended to be cool. So that, I guess, is the way we were able to tolerate the heat.
I haven't heard the word air conditioning, so I guess you didn't have
There
any.
was no air conditioning.
Did you said that you lived like a French elite? Why is it that the military were given those type of living conditions?
Well, as I said, there was not a military facility. The military that was there tended to be military advisors with um, military aid advisory group. Um, the French villas were being rented by Vietnamese to Americans, and we were assigned. Actually, during that time, we lived in two of them that were just magnificent. And of course, they came with servants. And this was my mother was overjoyed, but it was such a surprise. Um, but the
No,
French had been there before, so it had been, the most people don't realize that conflict in Vietnam was primarily a civil war and an effort to get the French out. They wanted to be self-ruled. They didn't want to be ruled by the French or anyone else, and so they had out when the Battle of Dien Bien Phu happened and the French lost. They called in all of the allies from World War II to help, and America to help. And that's when they had the Geneva Accord, and they came up with a peace settlement in which they would divide Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh, who had been a Viet Minh, which had been a student, a revolutionary group against the French during the Civil War. So they asked him to manage the North, and the United States brought in Diem, who was living in France. He had no support in South Vietnam at all. And the agreement was that in 2 years there would be a national election, and that the Vietnamese people would choose who they wanted to rule their country. Well, Jim knew he would not win, and so he held an election the next year, counting more people than were in the entire country, proclaimed himself president, established the uh, South Vietnam, the country of South Vietnam, and we, as the United States, supported that effort. We did not adhere to the agreement that had been made at the Geneva Accord for the national election. And so Ho Chi Minh, who had ceased conflict and was waiting for that election, was writing to Truman at the time saying, hey, we just want, it's like America. It's a civil war. We want our country unified, and we don't want to be run by the French. So part of our issue, or my issue, and I think our country's issue, has to be, you need to really understand the history of a country and its culture also, before you get involved and start trying to impose a view that might not quite fit with that country or what their needs are. And
What did you?
when my dad gave me those documents and said, if you don't understand history, you repeat it. He also said, we're doing the same thing in the Middle East, and that's come true.
What was it about the culture of the Vietnamese that stood out to you?
It was a beautiful culture. I must say that it has been a part of my view of the world since growing up there. The country is primarily Buddhist, and they believe in the will of heaven, the mandate of heaven. And, I think Americans never understood how Vietnam could turn overnight. But basically, they had a belief that if the ruler was corrupt and not uh, of the people, then he had no right to rule, and a country could turn overnight. They would immediately uh, cease to support or follow that individual. There, I've talked to people who've gone back to Vietnam. In fact, we call ourselves Saigon kids. Some of us who grew up there as kids, and one girl had been in front of her house where she had lived, and she was crying because it had been traumatic for her to leave and for what had gone on. And an old woman came up and put her arm around her and said, "Not you, not me, government, not you, not me." I mean, welcome with open arms. And it's partially why I encourage Vietnam vets and other people to go to Vietnam, because there isn't an animosity there. It's not the same way we respond with guilt or with anger. They have a different belief system, which is, it's not the individual, but it can be the will of heaven that changes everything.
Now, you said that you lost your childhood very quickly when you got to Saigon. What happened? Was there an event which triggered that?
Yes, I think that we were children. We were in our worlds. We lived in the continuous present. And we hadn't been there very long, I think maybe a month. And, we'd gotten used to just slipping out when our parents went somewhere and not telling anybody where we were going. But we happened that day to be playing dodgeball, and we heard what we thought were tanks. Now, my dad was a tank designer, and I've grown up around tanks all my life, and they're also part of military parades. So we immediately, as a group, decided that there was a parade going on and we were going to go see it. So we snuck out. We went up to, it was quite a ways, but we got to a gathering of people, Vietnamese, and we were much shorter than they were. And we worked our way to the front, and sure enough, it was tanks and guns and military. And we were really excited. We didn't see a band, we didn't see cotton candy, uh, but we did hear what sounded like a firework going off, an explosion. And it turned out it was a bullet, and it was a coup. And 400 people next to us, not that many people away, got shot and fell down dead. And we grabbed each other and ran as hard as we could back to the villa, slamming the door open, going up the steps, sliding across the marble floor, ending up under the bed and not coming out. When our parents arrived home, they didn't ask why we were under the bed. And we had an unwritten rule, which is they didn't ask, we did not tell. So we came out from under the bed, and they probably never knew about that event until um, we were well into living a civilian life, and I was probably in high school that it finally came out.
Were you afraid that it would affect you? That when you saw these killings, that they would go after you as well?
No, like I said, I never felt any animosity or any issue as far as a child with the Vietnamese. There was never a problem. There was almost an unwritten rule that we were not to be bothered, and we weren't. We were protected in some way. There was a highway called the Bin Ho Highway, and it went out of Saigon going towards the Tan Son Nhut Airport and up towards the main road going north. And the teenagers used to get on their motorbikes and like wildly drive up there at night, and like they called it dodging the bullets. They really were never shot at because the Vietnamese knew that they were kids. However, later, had it been a soldier, an adult that was doing that, they probably would have gotten shot. But the kids weren't. The kids weren't bothered.
So you, in spite of seeing a parade, you put that in quotes, that you saw, you still you felt comfortable living in Saigon for the period that you were there.
I did, but I must say that what changed for me was I became very observant. And I think people ask me a lot, like, how do you remember all that, what I've written in the book? And it's because I felt like my head turned 180 degrees at any given point. I was usually given charge of my younger brother and sister, so I had to feel on guard and protective of them when they were with me. So I was just very, very conscious of everything going on around me. Um, we later were in school and were told to get on the bus, and we were being taken home. It was like school was suddenly interrupted, and we were taken, this was in 1961. We were taken back to the second villa we were living on, Fontainebleau, and we had a roof garden. And so we were hearing bombing at the time, and we got dropped off at the house, ran upstairs and actually watched them bomb the presidential palace. And in both cases, in the case of the coup and in the bombing of the palace, it was Jim's own military that was against him because he was completely corrupt and he was not of the people or for the people. And so in the beginning, it was the army that had the coup. And in the bombing of the palace, it was his Air Force that had the coup. So I think that for me, I just took it in stride and adapted because that kind of is how we were raised. And I wasn't never really afraid.
What is it that your father actually? What was his function in the military? Why was he there in Vietnam?
Well, his background was he was a tank designer, and he used to, also develop things at the War College, and had, been in Fort Knox. And he had been sent over in World War II as General Patton's ordnance officer. And he was a Texas horse trader at heart. So his job was keep Patton going to get ordnance, whether it was filling up water tanks with French cognac and wine and trading it for tank treads.
Mm-hmm.
That was his job. He just did everything possible to keep Patton going. And so they sent him, prior to Vietnam, they sent him for a master's at the University of Chicago in ordnance training, and he was sent there to be chief of ordnance. And that meant he was in charge of all the depots, all the military equipment that was coming in, the training and setup of systems with the South Vietnamese Army, and had a very big role in kind of trying to create the footprint by which things could operate militarily.
Did you learn this later in life, or or did he tell you what he was doing at the time?
No, we knew it. He had referred to it, but I also I refer in my book that I was a spy at a very young age, and that was I really like to eavesdrop. And so whenever he'd have these meetings at night where people would come in the middle of the night, I would slide down the steps and hide and just listen. And I got to listen when Lee Van Sam had brought the expose, and he was talking about what was going to happen to him. Also, my father's responses, or whenever they were working out things. So, and I had been able to. At one point, we had a driver named Chu, who was my father's driver. But one day, he wanted to go gamble. So when he picked us up at the school, he took us to the South Vietnamese military headquarters and kind of parked the Jeep and went off to do whatever. And I got a great opportunity to watch a lot of things and see a lot of things that were going on there. Again, unbeknownst to my father. I think most of what we did there, they did not know about until we came back.
Now, you said you got
Um,
to look at, watch a lot of things. Like, give me an example of.
uh, well, I went looking for him, and I went around one of the Quonset huts, and there were young girls being trained because Madame Nu had wanted to create like a female army. And so they were young and they were being trained with weapons and they were doing military exercises. And I was quite astounded by that, thinking that's great. Women get to be part of something. Um, and I, just kind of being around these things, like I said, I paid attention.
Did you enjoy? You were there for 2 years. Did you enjoy the 2 years that you were in Saigon?
I loved it. I love the Vietnamese people. I think they're incredible people. Um, I also found that I created a life for myself, perhaps different than most people would have done. Though, in talking to other Saigon kids, many of them had their own little exploits that they were involved in. My brother, we would get sent to the underground theater whenever my mother didn't know what to do with us. And this was a storefront with a metal grill, partially open, that you slipped through. And when you got in there, you went down to what probably was a bomb shelter, but had been converted into a theater. So without ever finding out what movie was playing, we would get sent there. Well, I had a friend who was the aide to the general, and they would show the movie in the general's library until he came back from reconnaissance. So I'd already seen it by her and I slipping into the library, and now I was going to watch it another number of times. In this case, it was The World of Susie Wong, and I had watched it 21 times. In fact, if you play one note, two notes behind me, I
Uh-huh.
can tell you that it's coming on. I can do all the parts as well. But I couldn't take it anymore. And I looked up and I saw that my brother was no longer in the balcony, which meant that he must be doing something else. So when we got back on the bus, I saw him running from afar. And there was a circle near the theater. And what you had to do when you got there, because the traffic was so intense with ciclos and bicycles and taxis, you pretty much had to learn to zen. We called it zenning. So you just stopped, you got composure, and you began to walk across this intersection of traffic because there was no way it was going to stop, but they would avoid hitting you if you were constant at one pace. And so you would slowly zen across, and then when you got to the other side, you'd run. So, of course, he did that and then ran and slid into the bus just as the door was closing. And at that point in time, I knew he was up to something and I wanted part of it. So I blackmailed him, and it turned out that he was basically going into the post exchange before we got on the bus, getting contraband and selling it on the black market. So with the threat of being of blackmail and me telling on him, he made me part of the plan. Only this time I got my product was baby powder and Hershey bars, and Hershey bars sold fine. He set me up with a kind of a mat and an old Coke crate, and I'd put all my wares out there. And I'm a little Caucasian blonde kid. Okay, now the Vietnamese really like touch you to see if you felt different from
Yes.
them, and your hair also. So you're always being touched. So I would convince them my blonde hair and the white skin was the result of the baby powder in French. And I would break up pieces of the chocolate bar and that sold easily. But I had a goal. Had decided that I wanted to go to the Olympics and I needed a horse. Now, I didn't know how to ride, but this was a dream. And so I thought I could finance it this way.
And what was your brother selling?
He actually was selling the baby powder, but I think he was selling it to the Coke dealers.
And how long did this last?
Oh, we had it going on for 2 years.
Huh.
I made a lot of money. My mother found it 2 years after we came back because I had to actually do money laundering. I had to change it from piastres to military script. And then I had to change out the military script when we hit a military facility in the United States because I wasn't sure. My dad was very upset about Vietnam. I wasn't sure if he was going to quit before we got to another facility. So I had to go around and change my military script into American dollars in Seattle. And I put it in my cigar box and kept it there. Well, I had it on a shelf in my closet, and we're now 2 years after Vietnam. We're in Naperville, Illinois, and I come home, and this is the time of like mini skirts and fishnet stockings and white lipstick. So that's what I look like, which may be, and I probably look like a prostitute. I walked in, and there's my mom with this pile of money on the kitchen table and suggesting that we should talk. And I'm telling her, oh, it was a long time ago. And she's like, when? I said, in Saigon. She said, I knew where you were all the time. I said, well, not really. And she's like, you had an allowance. Why would you need this? I said, Mom, I've got to get a horse. I've got to go to the Olympics. And she's like, but you don't know how to ride. I said, I know. This has been the sticking point all along. So she was great. We put the money in the bank. We got the horse. And she eventually, I had her 28 years. She died in my arms in Yardley, PA.
Well, Sandy Hanna, it's time for us to take a break. She's the author of The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon. She was there with her family. Her father was in the military in 1960 to 1962. When we return, I'm going to ask her what the ignorance of bliss stands for and what that means. This is The World of Work. I'm your host, Shep Cohen, and now this.
Hi, I'm Darlene Love, and I'm listening to Shep Cohen. He's a rebel on WDVR FM. God bless. Bye-bye.
A peanut sat on a railroad track. His heart was all aflutter. Along came the choo-choo train.
Peanut butter.
You're listening to WDVR FM 89.7 Delaware Township.
Peanut butter.
Hi, this is Al Burke, your host of Saturday Night Jazz. Listen in for the cool sounds of jazz with great artists such as Herbie Hancock, Natalie Cole, Stan Getz, and Sarah Vaughan. As we listen to these jazz legends, you will discover great new music. Join me Saturday night from 9 p.m. to midnight, only on WDVR FM.
Hi, folks. Every Saturday on the original Bluegrass Junction, we share with you the best in traditional bluegrass music. Join me, Rich Evans, this Saturday, 1 to 4 p.m. on Penn Jersey Radio, 89.7 WDVR, Delaware Township.
Tune in Friday nights from 7 to 10 p.m. and relive the big band years right here on WDVR.
Hi, this is Gene. Tune in Fridays at 5 for 2 hours of energetic rock and pop that'll help you to remember what it felt like to really rock back in your hippie days. That's Anything Goes. Fridays, 5 to 7, only here on WDVR.
Boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom, doo 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 boom, boom.
We plant the food, we drive the cab, we load the ship, we run the lab, we build the bridges, we fly type of page. We clean the streets. We sew the clothes, we change the sheets. We sell the goods, yes we do. We lay the stone, we do the work. This is our home. We do the work. 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 This is our home.
And we do the work here on WDVR. And our guest this afternoon is Sandy Hanna, the author of The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon. Sandy Hanna, what was the ignorance of bliss?
I think the ignorance of bliss is that we entered Vietnam ignorant. We were blissful. We'd come out of this. The United States had come out of World War II as victors. We felt invincible. We felt that our view of the world was the view. We didn't bother to really understand the country and the history that we were entering into. And so I say it's the ignorance of bliss because we went in there really uneducated and really naive. And the unfortunate part is there was a great lesson to learn in what happened in Vietnam and our approach and how we viewed it, what we did, that could have helped to keep us from becoming involved in other conflicts in which we entered with the same ignorance. And so I named it the ignorance of bliss because as a child, it certainly is that way. You go in blissful and you generally are ignorant and you learn as you experience. And we learned, but we didn't retain it and we didn't apply it.
Are there any lasting effects on children of the military who are living in countries that are about to or in the process of unraveling, like Vietnam?
I think each child has a different response. There are a lot of sites for brats. That's British Regiment Attached Transfers, and we see ourselves as a subculture. And it's been interesting on Facebook, really learning about some of the things. Some children are totally traumatized, and some are not. And it just depends on, I think, the makeup of the person. I'm not sure why I ended up the way I did. I think I was just kind of I was put in charge and I took charge because that was the role I had to play with my siblings. But I have heard that in many cases it has been devastating for military kids. In other cases, it's just part and parcel of what we knew we would be experiencing and what would be happening. In some cases, the families tried to educate their children as to the situation. Others didn't take the time. I think there was also a belief that children are just very adaptive and responsive. And I think the child rearing backgrounds in education has gotten a little bit more sophisticated than, say, in the days when I was growing up.
Now, you've mentioned that you think it's a good idea for veterans to return to Vietnam. 2 questions. You consider yourself a veteran, and did you return?
I was supposed to return to work on a Habitat for Humanity bill in South Saigon, but it was at the time that the book was coming out, so I didn't get to go on that one. And then I was going to go just before COVID, and the COVID hit, and I didn't get to go. But I will go. My intention is to go. I definitely want to go. And there have been reunions of Saigon kids occurring. In fact, we're talking about maybe having one in Saigon. So if that happens, I hope I'll be able to do it. I encourage veterans because I think they'll be surprised by the reception they will get. They will be welcome. Like I say, they'll be open-armed, welcomed, because they won't be looked at as that they are personally responsible for what happened. Vietnamese believe that was the government's, it was the mandate of heaven, it is what occurred, and they don't hold this animosity that we Americans often hold, and I think probably is very confusing to most Americans. In fact, I've heard from vets who have gone back and just been overwhelmed at the reception and the kindness of the Vietnamese people. So I think there's a lot of trauma that occurred for many Americans who participated in this conflict, and I think it would be healing and helpful for them to return. But I also know that in some cases it was so traumatic that there is no possibility they could actually go back there.
Well, why did you write the book rather than your father?
I think he felt that I could come at it from a different point of view. As I said, and he wanted it to be something that people would find it easy to find a way into the story. And I think I said I really am influenced by To Kill a Mockingbird, a story of a child in the middle of the South experiencing prejudice. Also, The Great Santini, which Pat Conroy, who's also a brat, wrote about growing up as a military kid with the colonel as his father. And then I really felt connected to Year of Living Dangerously, which was about a civil war that was going on in an Asian country. And that those three things were of an influence to me. And I thought that if I could come at it from the child's perspective, that I could blend a story that would get people to learn something, but enjoy the story that they were reading. At the end of some of the chapters, I put a moment in history, and my effort there is to provide what happened after or what happened before that particular story and how it contributed to the outcome of our involvement in Vietnam.
How long did it take you to actually write the book?
I would say that I was writing parts of it. It just seemed to be, I had chapters here and there. I didn't have a cohesive um, plot line. And it took me looking at the structure of a film, how to structure a film, that I finally got a structure that would work, where it was, you have an event that occurs in the beginning that creates what's going to happen after. And in the middle, it's fun and games, some of the things that fill in and develop the characters. And then at the end, you come full circle to the consequence of that first thing that happened. And that structure allowed me to fill in all the kind of mini stories that were in my head and written on pieces of paper. And it really came together at one point. And I think my father would have been happy with it. Unfortunately, he passed before he got a chance to read it. But I think his intention was that I would do it similar to the way I did it.
Did you enjoy the actual writing, sitting down and writing, or was it a burden?
No, I actually enjoyed it. I literally, my husband was doing a residency, a photography residency in the western part of Greece at Costa Navarino. And we were given a wonderful room, and he had like a 56-day residency. And I pretty much stayed in the room, and I had sticky notes. So I took 3 walls, and I took these sticky notes, and I would write that story or the part of the story, and I would stick it up on the wall that it would go to of this 3-part structure. And so I had this entire room filled with sticky notes. And it's actually because I could just sit in that room and not be bothered. I could write all day, and I could play around with what went where, and I could reorganize it. And I literally got the thing into its final form in which I could then clean up and work a little bit more on the detail. But that's when it came together.
Who's your audience?
I know my audience is definitely anybody military related and to kids in military. I also think it's boomers. Most of the boomers did not understand Vietnam. They didn't know why they were being sent there. They still don't, and I think it gives them something to hold on to and realize what really went on in the background that led to everything. But I also think modern day, I think, we've got a lot of things going on right now in the Middle East. And my belief is that if you understand Vietnam and understand what went on there and the decisions that got made and how we entered in that, not understanding the culture and the history, you get a real parallel. It isn't just the evacuations. That's the end story. There's so much more in between that needs to be understood. So I do believe even today, uh, a young person, middle-aged person, old person, I think all of them would enjoy the book, and I think they'd learn a lot.
Are there any overriding memories that you have of Saigon? Do you think back, or is it adding together?
I feel like I remember everything. I just found it such a fascinating place and fascinating culture. One of the things that probably was most helpful to me, we had a daughter, the daughter of our cook, Chiba, was a college student, and she also lived in the quarters at our house. And she spent an awful lot of time with me trying to get me to understand what was going on, to take any misperceptions I had. For example, in social studies, we'd be cutting out pictures of, making our social studies report. And if we were on Vietnam, it was be pictures of Viet Cong killed and out of the Stars and Stripes newspaper that we got. And she would just take me aside and say, no, here's what you need to understand about this. And I guess that work she did to try to keep me clear allowed me not to go with the misperceptions that perhaps others were involved in.
Now
so she stands out above all.
Does Vietnam and Saigon, do they stand out among the various countries that you've gone to?
Oh yes, I think that was probably the most formative time for me. It created the person I am and how I view the world and how I approach the world. And I also think too, by not having gotten killed in that coup, I approach life as I have it today. I might not have it tomorrow. And I don't know if that ties into the Buddhist orientation of life, which is similar, but I approach life that way.
When you came back to America in 1962, your father didn't stay in the military very long. What happened? Why did he decide to resign?
We were sent to Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is kind of a command center. It's where a lot of the officers that are coming back from overseas deployments end up, and then 2 years later they get reassigned. During that time, he was told that he would be being shipped back to Vietnam because as an ordnance, chief of ordnance, he had created an incredible program and they wanted him back to continue. And as I said, after he dealt with the expose on Sam, and he did take it to the Pentagon, he tried to make those above him understand what was going on politically with this regime that we were backing, and also with the history of Vietnam. He didn't believe in Vietnam and that this was a winnable war. And believe me, he was a colonel, he was an officer. He believed, if you're going to go play, you better have a program that's going to work and you better be able to finish the job. And he didn't believe that was possible. So he did resign as a result of those orders.
And then you had to re-enter civilian life, if that's the right word. What was it like for a brat kid to go from a military school to whatever school you went to, which was not in a military school?
I think that I was viewed as someone who had just stepped off the moon. I was still wearing Vietnamese tailored clothing. I still was, probably still as dark as can be from having been in the sun for so much. My hair was blonde. I had it cut off because um, my sister and I had it cut really short because we just, we didn't want to attract being petted all the time. And also from military officers feeling because they've left their kids at home, here's some cute kids, let's hug them. So we got very, um, careful about how we looked in order to just not be bothered as kids. And so I still was growing out that hair. And I had a different worldview and I spoke another language. And I didn't know what this was about. I hadn't seen a TV show. I didn't know what they were talking about. Military kids, we don't necessarily have cliques because we're so grateful to find each other and make a friend that we don't discriminate in terms of anything. Where you're from, whether you're black, white, gay, whatever it is, we don't. We just take you for what it is we can find that we like, and we ignore the rest of it if we don't like it because we know we're not going to be there for long. You might leave tomorrow. I might leave tomorrow. So we try to stay in the moment and find what we like. And I had never experienced cliques and bullying and the pettiness and the meanness of people. I honestly, I hated that period of time. Hated it.
You mentioned in passing your mother. What did she do when she was in Vietnam?
My mom was the perfect military wife because what her job really was one, to keep sanity with us, but to really support my father's career. And that meant giving the parties, bridge, golf, whatever it was, having the cocktail parties at the house, creating the social life for not only him, but for fellow officers, because so many of them did not come with their wives or their families. But that was her role, and she was really one of the best. I'll tell you, she was really good at it. I actually I would be the intermittent bartender in the beginning of parties until they got a little, I could mix a couple of drinks. And once they got a little tanked, I would be sent to bed. But I got quite good at it. But we had a lot of parties and we had a lot of things. She would more or less create a social environment for American wives.
And why is it that some in the military would have bring along their families and their spouses, and others didn't?
I think a lot of times the families themselves did not want to come. They didn't want to pull their kids out of the schools. They didn't want to have the disruption. It might have been that they felt that it wasn't an appropriate place for children to be or families to be. I don't think my parents ever considered that. They didn't consider leave. My mother would not have allowed herself to be left behind, and therefore we would be coming with her. So that was just her unique self. I think others just chose not to, and that means the wives chose not to have the disruption.
We're coming to about 2 minutes left in the show. It's really zoomed by. Any closing thoughts about your book, The Ignorance of Bliss, An American Kid in Saigon?
Well, I think because I'm an artist and a painter, I wrote the book visually. When you read it, you will see it. You will feel like you're part of the journey, and I hope that's true because that was the intent. And my goal, hopefully, is to eventually get this into a screenplay and a movie, so the visual side of it comes out. I encourage people to read it. I think you'll learn a lot, and I think you'll have a different perspective on the conflict in Vietnam, what went on, the people, and it's easily available either on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and in this area, Farley's Bookshop. So I really hope people read it. I hope you get in touch with me and tell me what you think.
And how
I
can
tried to provide it in a way that I think you can easily access the experience.
and if someone wants to get in contact with you, what means should
If
they
you want to
use?
get in contact with me, you can go to my website, which is just Sandy Hanna. So that's ANDYHANNA.net. And there's a contact uh, button there, and just fill it out and I can get back to you, give me information so I can get in touch. But that would probably be the best way to get a hold of me.
Well, Sandy Hanna, thank you very much for joining us on the World of Work this afternoon. Having read your book, it was fascinating. The Ignorance of Bliss: An American Kid in Saigon. I hope my listeners got as much from our discussion as I got from the book. But good luck to you, and thank you for joining us. And I really thought that you presented yourself very well. Thank you for being on the World of Work with me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Shep. I really enjoyed this interview.
My pleasure. Until next week, this is The World of Work, and I'm your host, Shep Cohen. And coming up next is Gene with Anything Goes. And then after Gene is through, we have Carla, and the night goes on. Friday nights are special on WDVR. And until next time, this is The World of Work. I'm your host, Shep Cohen.